Hi, Kevin.
I see Pete and I decided to wear the
Pete.
same shirt tonight.
Apparently
Gosh.
using the same fashion coordinator.
I know the haircut, I know.
So who have we got in here? Okay.
I just got home from work, so I'm just gonna scarf the last couple bites here before I turn back on.
Can I ask, Pete, I see an attendee of Kenneth Allen. And who would that be? Do we know?
I
No?
don't know, no.
Okay. Okay, just curious. Thank you. Okay. 6 o'clock. I'll call our meeting to order. This is a committee of the whole meeting. And I'll just say that we're privileged to gather here on the territory of the Kwakwala speaking people. And we have an agenda in front of us, which is really simply to discuss the active transport network plan that was released last week. I believe on the 16th is when it was put out to us. And we're just having a discussion this evening ahead of our public meeting because there are a couple items in there that will come up on our agenda for tonight's meeting. So with that, could I have a motion to adopt the agenda, I guess?
So moved.
Gabby and Anne Marie, thank you. All in favor? And we'll carry on. So Kevin, having not spoken to you, perhaps if it would be appropriate, and Pete, please let me know, would it be okay for Kevin just to hit the highlights of this document and then we will focus on questions, because I know some of the counselors have read through the document and will have certain questions. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
If I may, I do have a bit of a presentation to sort of summarize the document, where it came from, sort of some of the key bits and pieces that we focused on because of the nature of the BC Active Transportation Infrastructure Program. So give that
Perfect.
framework, and then my recommendation is this is a discussion. So please, as I go through, please ask as many questions as you wish, and we can deal with the questions throughout the presentation, or if you wish, we can deal with those at the end.
Okay. Okay, if people do have questions, maybe if you could use the hand feature. I don't know if we have that as an option here. If we do, would you just raise your hand and we'll I'll bring it to the attention if that would work. Okay, go ahead, Kevin.
I do need to be able to share my screen.
That's on Pete.
Whomever has control.
That should work for you.
Sure does.
Perfect.
So here we go. Very nice to see you all again. Brief presentation. Like I said, I'd rather it be a discussion than me being a talking head. This is you've all had an opportunity to look at the document. I'm sure there's lots of questions, and that's what I'm here for tonight. The presentation will just go over the actual requirements of the BC Active Transportation Granting Program. Quick recap of the process that we've gone through for the project. The network that has been identified and some of the key elements of that network that we've identified. The projects that were identified through that process and the prioritization and how that occurred. The cost estimates that were provided and what the next steps are with regards to this project here. So when we speak to the BC Active Transportation and Infrastructure Grant Program, it is actually a very specific program and has some key objectives that we needed to consider throughout the actual project itself. What you see before you is the primary objectives of the program. The two objectives that they typically focus on in this project is the very first one, that idea of the accessible and safe network for human-powered transportation. And the fourth one, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. They typically are the two sort of focuses that they do have, and some of the key elements that they do look at in the actual granting program when they look at the projects for future infrastructure grants, but also look at the projects in regards to what we've identified as part of the project itself. This here is actually a picture of the part of the contract and the requirements that we are required to ensure that our document provides. So you see there's a lot of different things here: community profile, strategic context, things of that nature. The document we gave you is very large, and there's a lot of appendices. And the reason there's so many appendices is to meet the requirements actually of the granting program itself. One of the things we wanted to produce was actually a very straightforward and easily to implement document. But it's a challenge when you have so many things that you have to provide to the province for granting program. What we've done is the area that is identified in red is sort of the meat and potatoes of the actual document. And this is the key component of the document where the majority of the other items are actually provided in the appendices. The plan and implementation piece really is the piece that the majority of us will be actually interested in. That's how are we going to do this? What's the important part? Where is it going to go? All the other stuff, as you can see, like even the potential greenhouse gas emissions reduction calculations that we're required to do, and reviewing the ICBC crash statistics and things like that for the community, which we did throughout this project, are all included in the appendices, because when it comes down to actually implementing the plan, that stuff's important for background knowledge, but isn't important for the overall implementation as we move forward. So when we look at the overall requirements and objectives of the plan itself, one of the key things we need to do is ensure that we create some objectives that are consistent with the actual granting program itself. The objectives you see before you now are actually based on the review of the census data and review of all the information we collected throughout the actual process itself. One of the very interesting things that actually came out when reviewing all of the data is that right now, Port McNeill, under the census data, has 10% of all residents commuting by active modes of transportation currently. It's very high. That's very high for any community in British Columbia and very high for any community on North Vancouver Island. So that's actually excellent. So with that, we actually have to make a projection or a goal that is actually above that 10%. And that's where that 15% came from. With that, that by 2030. And then with that, you need to try to aim beyond that and what you can potentially achieve when you also achieve the remainder of the objectives of the increasing of that active transportation infrastructure within the community. One of the key things I'll mention here too is that when you look at active transportation and people utilizing active transportation modes, you have to assume that they're not moving with active modes 100% of the time. That's unreasonable, especially in our climate and the geography of Port McNeill. There's lots of really steep hills. So you'll find that when you look at the data that we looked at and looked at the projections that we gave, we assumed that people aren't going to be moving by active transportation modes 100% of the time. The weather in our area doesn't permit it, and the geography doesn't permit it for everyone that is utilizing active transportation modes themselves. The one objective that I really want to touch base on here, and I'll actually elaborate it on here at the end, closer to the end of the presentation, is the last one. The town will design new trails and routes to connect to a broader regional trail network. Port McNeill finds itself in a very unique situation where the informal trail network that surrounds the community is amazing. And the opportunity that informal trail network it holds for the community is quite large. And one of the reasons that we actually have a trail specific section actually in the plan itself to address trail specifications and propose a trail hierarchy for the town. So as we go, we look at the process and how our process has rolled out. The intent was to run the overall consultation process concurrently with the OCP process, which started off that way, of course, until COVID reared its head again. It started off with the interactive map, and that interactive map was launched specifically as a tool to collect information for the active transportation plan, but provide an opportunity for some additional information to be provided for the official community plan. From that, we also launched the in-person session where we had that workbook session back in October, and then the workbook survey, which we basically provided the workbook out to people to review and provide that back to us. That information was collected, looked at, synthesized, and we also utilized a lot of that information to do a specific questions in the survey 2 that went out in December, specifically in regards to active transportation, how people would like to move around the community, and if they had active transportation infrastructure, how they would potentially move around the community. From that, we actually created a list of projects and a list of active transportation components that the community identified and what we had identified through the overall network assessment, and did the project prioritization survey that was released in February that I'll speak to again here momentarily. Before I delve into the network, I can take any questions now, or I can delve right in and keep plowing through my various slides and discussion at this stage.
Go ahead, Anne
I'll-
Marie.
Okay.
You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't get unmuted. So these additional targets, what is the, like if we have them and then we don't act on them, what position or what risk does that put us in? Like you're saying before we had a 10% of active transportation and now we have to up that. Is there any jurisdiction or is there any risk, I guess, essentially by adopting these targets when they may not be really manageable?
Yeah, excellent question. So the targets themselves aren't a regulatory thing or anything like that. It's a framework to allow the town to go, okay, this is what we want to try to achieve and work towards achieving that. But it isn't like, oh, you must achieve this. That's not the intent of the targets themselves. The intent is to look at, this is where we are and this is what we want to try to achieve. And then the plan itself provides the sort of framework on what you can try to do to achieve that target. But they are not regulatory and they're not punitive. So if you don't meet them by 2030, they're not going to say, oh, you messed up. That's not the intent of the targets.
Great, thanks. Derek, did I hear your voice?
Yes,
I guess you,
thank you.
Go ahead, Derek.
I had a question about the 10% figure. Is that from the census? And it doesn't separate bikes from walking, correct? And just wondered how you got that figure.
Yeah, so the 10% was from the census data. It does not separate modes specifically. It has active modes, human powered modes, and then non-human powered modes. And so neither does overall active transportation, right? The goal is active transportation, which is any human powered form. It could be rollerblading or skateboarding, or and so the intent is to get people out and about and commuting and moving around without use of on their own power, without using a vehicle specifically. So cycling and walking and running and skateboarding, all of those would fall under the active transportation component.
Thank you.
Ryan?
yeah, I guess a couple of questions. I wish I had a copy of what you were reading from, because I can't remember that stuff as fast as you say it. But I'm trying to figure out how much of what you said in the consultation process was the OCP and how much of it was specifically the active transportation plan. That's my first question.
So can you see my screen, Councillor Mitchell?
I can.
Perfect. So the interactive map, or the original interactive map, the digital map, was focused on active transportation. The in-person session, the workbook survey, and the survey number 2 were combined active transportation and OCP. And the project prioritization survey was active transportation focused.
So the workbook that we did in, where was it? The community hall? I can't remember, the gym in the old school.
Yep,
Is
exactly.
that what we're talking about here?
Correct.
Okay. So I thought that was the OCP. I didn't realize it was the active transportation. Didn't catch that. That was my first question. As you know, I have a problem with the amount of online non-personal surveying that's happening, and I don't believe it's sufficient. And I haven't changed my view on that. The other thing I noted on, and there's no page numbers, but in section 1, introduction at the bottom of the page, it describes active transportation, and that description doesn't line up with what's found on the active transportation website. I went there and had a look, and they include pilot projects for active transportation. E-scooters, skateboards, e-skateboards, micro mobility devices are clean and efficient way to get around in BC. And it goes on to say that pilot projects are being done in several communities and so on. So, and to say all that to say this, I use a power wheelchair, and your description says if somebody's pushing me, that's active transportation. But if I'm driving a power wheelchair, it's not. I struggle with that because I don't really think that's the intent of the program. And nor is it the intent of the program to completely eliminate non-manual means of getting around. In other words, electric devices, as you can see from, well, you can't see it, I can, I printed it off, but they're working with the government to have the legislation changed to allow things like e-scooters, so that that would become part of active transportation, right? So it's a broader reach than what's there. So I just like to make that that point, that I'd like to be included in this. And wheelchairing by its very nature is mechanized. It's just no way around it. So whether you're pushing it yourself or using batteries, it's mechanized. And as I said, the public process, I think, doesn't have enough depth for me. That's all I have to say at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are awesome comments, actually. And with regards to the electronic stuff, we've had this conversation. We actually did receive a lot of hard copies in regards to the project prioritization survey also, as well as the other ones, as you know. As regards to the use of e-vehicles in general as part of active transportation, that's an excellent point. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Like this is one of those fields that is quickly transitioning right across North America. And you see it in cities where they have like rental e-scooters or rental e-bikes and things of that nature. So that, I think, that is something that we could certainly address in it. The definition of active transportation we took from the program itself. That doesn't mean that needs to be the definition for what we do for Port McNeill. So that is something we could certainly look at.
Are there any other questions? Seeing none, do you want to carry
Awesome.
on, please?
I'll delve on. So
Thank you.
the network. So the network itself, one of the key things, I believe Councillor Mitchell has a question.
Do you have a question, Councillor Mitchell? I think you're okay to go.
Okay. So the network itself really is.
I blew it. I was chattering away to a muted microphone. My apologies. The Trails Master Plan. Can I assume that we're not doing anything to develop that? That's not part of this process. Is that right?
We have actually proposed a trail hierarchy and trail standards for the town, but the overall sort of a Trails Master Plan is not part of this project at this time.
And my other question, who made the decision on how the routes are classified?
I'm about to get into that right now.
Okay, I'll leave that with you. Thank you.
Great. So the trail network, when you're looking at trail networks, or active transportation networks, one of the ways that you're required to do them, and then this is sort of outlined in sort of the best practice, is determining where your key sort of traffic generation points are and your destinations are. You can't see it super well, but in behind this slide, you can see the key destinations map for the community. you see the key employment nodes, and the residential areas are your key traffic generators from a standpoint of active transportation. So back in the fall, myself, John Sorensen, and Councillor Coyle actually rode around all of Port McNeill to figure out, okay, what actually makes sense in regards to where to put these routes. How do we create routes that collect the most people possible and bring them to the key destinations within the community itself? So we rode all of these routes. And then I actually re-walked almost all of them also when we did the door hanger knocking survey. Actually, at that time, I was actually taking notes in regards to active transportation when I was walking around handing out the door hangers, because it was a great experience to actually look at the network in two different ways, as a walker and as a cyclist. So these routes were identified based on how they connected the areas of the community to key destinations. On the map before you, the red on Haddington Broughton, and I noticed today that Broughton actually Boulevard's in the wrong place on this map, and I'm going to fix that. Mine Road from Campbell Way to I believe it's Bettis, and then Campbell Way itself are really the spines. They're the primary routes. Those are the routes that people will go to travel on back and forth as the primary routes. Your orange routes is what we call those secondary routes. The secondary routes are really sort of feeders into the primary routes and key connections to other components of tertiary routes or recreational trails. And then the black and white dotted ones, we call those the tertiary routes, which are those sort of quick shortcuts or those informal trails that people might use to connect onto the primary and secondary routes. Which each one of those classifications comes a different set of infrastructure that typically goes with a route. On a primary routes, they typically are your Cadillac of active transportation, right? The typical cross section you'd have is a nice big sidewalk, a nice big bike lane, your vehicle travel way, and the same on the other side to provide like a full cross section to allow for all forms of transportation, not only vehicular transportation, but your active transportation components. Then within your sort of the primary hierarchies where you have your key multi-use trails. So that is the Campbell Way pink line connecting the Rotary Trail all the way to the downtown. One of those key connections in a multi-use trail where you separate the pedestrians from your key traffic corridors. Your secondary routes typically have painted bike lanes and painted bike lane signage. That's your secondary route. You let people know these are intended for active transportation, but they don't have necessarily sidewalks and all of the different pieces along the entire corridor. Where your tertiary routes typically just have signage. You let people know these are shared routes. Be aware, people are going to be using these for active modes of transportation. And so people know that they exist and what they're for. Does that help answer your question, Councillor Mitchell?
Most of these routes that you've noted here do have sidewalks. What does that mean to the active plan, transport plan?
Well, that's actually excellent. The fact that the sidewalk program that Port McNeill has is very progressive, and it means that you have a fairly good walking active transportation component already constructed for the community.
Okay,
That's great.
Any questions? Not seeing anything.
Yes,
Councillor.
please. We did ride around and that was a fun afternoon. I think you've got that Haddington route going down Woodland.
Mhm.
I think we kind of missed the mark there. Normally we keep going on Haddington Crescent, go down Kingcome, which goes by the school, some dense apartments, etc. It goes by the hospital. By making that main route all the way down, you know, almost kind of 3/4 of the way down Mine Road, it's quite a big hill back up, and I just don't see that as a good productive way. So I don't know if that was just an oversight. That's the main thing that jumped out at me about this. And
Yeah,
go ahead.
I can explain why we chose that route overall. One of the reasons we actually chose that route was specifically in regards to the future development lands associated directly, I guess it's north of that route on Wood Road and Mine Road. That area is designated for almost all the residential future development for the town. And so for that, that's why we chose that the what's it, Wood Road connection
Woodland.
between, pardon me?
Woodland.
Oh, thank you. Connection between Haddington and Mine. That was the justification for that. If council deems that's the wrong route, there's nothing stating that having it run all the way to Haddington to Campbell Way is not a reasonable location, but that was the justification why we placed that there. Knowing that the infrastructure to be constructed along that primary route is very costly and will take a lot of time and years to actually end up constructing it out. So that's one of the justifications for why we did that. Doesn't mean it's we need to go that way. That's the reason for this conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out the route I described goes by like the school and there's no RVs on the road. It goes by the apartment blocks and there's generally no RVs on the road there. Whereas Woodland is just, I wouldn't send my kids riding down there. I think the other route is safer. A lot of people are used to seeing that. I'd love it if we thought that area was going to get developed in the next 5 or 10 years, but I kind of doubt it. And along Woodland, the town recently bought a lot for future planning, waterfront access. Are you aware of that? And is that something that could be incorporated into this plan?
I'm not currently aware of that. It's something we could place in if needed. I'm not too sure where it's located at this stage. So
It's actually very conveniently located below the hospital property, and we have an easement all the way through there.
Okay.
And then it's just one residential lot that backs a green belt that goes all the way to the water. That's been identified in our official community plan and our the zoning, the future zoning for that area as, you know, real trail friendly, etc. So I think maybe that is a missed opportunity.
So one of the things we can do is identify potential future connectivity. One of the key components of the plan is really to identify active transportation components at this stage for future funding opportunities. So if council deems that is, then it's something that we could potentially integrate.
Okay. Any other? Oh, go ahead, Pete.
Just on Councillor Cole's notes, I would caution council about identifying that as a network route at this point. We did get a little bit of feedback from the private owned forest management that without consultation with them, we wouldn't want to identify that in a permanent plan as being a route without further consultation with the private forest managed land.
Thank you, Pete. Go ahead, Anne Marie.
That's kind of what I was going to say. Having it makes sense to go by the school, to go by the apartment buildings to get to the hospital. The other route, you're hooking into so much private land, and that development was what, 25 years ago, and it's still not developed, right? And it seems like if we've got grant opportunities, it would make sense to maybe buffer up what is actively being used, wouldn't it?
Go ahead, Kevin.
So in regards to sort of the Broughton-Haddington corridor, the way it wasn't a prioritized project, just so you know, it was actually very low on the list. But if it was prioritized, my recommendation would be working from downtown to this side of the map. The reason being, the type of active transportation infrastructure slated for that route is very, very expensive. So you're probably looking at multi-billion-dollar per kilometer of active transportation route. So you typically want to start from your sort of the key destination and work out. So a corridor of that length, you're probably looking at a 20 to 25-year time frame to construct out realistically, at least, due to the cost of the type of active transportation. So that's what I was thinking. But I do take your point very clearly in regards to the Haddington, and having Haddington corridor as that primary connection does make a lot of sense. And I see what you guys are saying, having that Haddington corridor as the primary versus a secondary along that stretch there, certainly.
Could I add to that, Chairperson?
Go ahead.
I think the reason the primary route was not ranked higher on your survey is because nobody knows what AT primary route, like, I got a bit of a beef that council or nobody actually saw the draft survey. And the first time I saw it was in the mailbox. And I think we really missed the mark. You know, at first I thought it was pretty good, but then when I dug into it a bit, like, if we'd have called that bike route or something, people might have been able to grasp their heads around it. AT primary route, you know, kind of makes sense for people who know about active transportation plans. So yeah, I think that's a big part of why it didn't score so high. You know, and we really only, you know, got a small amount of surveys, 80 or something. And all the other input was with regards to the official community plan. Councillor Mitchell asked about that workbook thing. That was all the official community plan. It was not the active transportation plan. I mean, unless I'm really wrong on that, correct me. So just in closing, I was hoping somebody could comment on the decision to release the survey without council's input. I do believe we saw some of the other surveys ahead of time for the OCP. All right. Thank you.
Go ahead, Councillor.
Go ahead, Kevin. I don't have an answer to that question.
No, I don't have an answer to the specific question about the survey going out particularly for review to council, other than the fact that the projects themselves were identified throughout the process. The wording on it, you know, the one comment, the interactive map, the digital interactive map, even when you read the first front page, was all about the active transportation plan. There are key questions throughout the workbook and the workbook survey that were specifically around active transportation and were worded in that manner because we knew at that time that we were trying to run the active transportation project and the OCP consultation project concurrently so we could save the town money. So we didn't have to actually duplicate consultation processes. And so it was, we had openly make sure that things were worded for active transportation purposes throughout those surveys. In regards to why council didn't see the particular survey released for prioritization, don't know explicitly why, other than the timeframes in regards to the deadlines for having this plan done and the amount of time that we needed to actually write the plan specifically. So I believe we're under a bit of a gun to actually have that survey out in short order.
If I may, I'm a little confused because I thought there were two separate contracts. The active transportation plan came first, and then the official community plan came second. And so correct me if I'm wrong there. And did the budget of the active transportation plan change? It was 50,000. And I noticed a note in an email earlier where you had mentioned in order to save money on consultation, they were joined. So did the active transportation plan price per se or contract change or go down and some of that money went to the OCP? And I to be honest, there were two separate projects, and if you could comment on that, please.
Through your worship to Councillor Coyle. Yes, Peter and I worked directly to reduce the overall cost of the active transportation plan because of the way that the grant is situated and stuff like that. They will match up to 50%. And so we actually worked to coordinate so we could reduce the overall cost that the town would pay for the active transportation plan. Right now, we're probably, I think we went from about $49,000 down to about 46. I'd have to look up the background information, Councillor Coyle, to confirm. Right now, I believe left in the budget, there's probably another $8,000 we haven't spent due to the efficiencies that we were able to find due to the consultation process utilized throughout the process itself. So
Okay,
the end goal with my conversations with the CAO was really in trying to save the town money through the running the processes concurrently.
I appreciate that. You know, my recollection is we put in 25,000 for a 50,000 grant, and council never had the discussion of watering that down. That's no slight on you. I don't think the decision was made by the CAO for cost savings and not have a $50,000 plan. That's what we signed up for. And I don't expect you to comment on that, but I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
I'll just step in and make the comment here, is it was always my understanding that part of this process and why we had this structured the way it is that it just made sense to do the active transport plan in conjunction with the official community plan. There were efficiencies. It meant going to the community and sort of asking the whole basket, presenting the whole basket in front of the community at multiple opportunities, whether it was the survey, whether it was the active transport survey, the physical survey, online survey, is we were going to the group, to the town, we were reducing the amount of times we were going to them, and mostly to avoid any kind of survey fatigue. We were looking to capture what was the priority. And so to have these done in conjunction was always my understanding. So as to funding and budgets, well, we can talk about that later. Are there any other questions on this here network?
Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. That raise hand button doesn't seem to work.
You know what it is, just so I can say, guys, I do appreciate when you speak up, is because of the screen sharing, I only see whoever is speaking or most recently spoke in front of me.
Right. Okay. So that's,
Thank
yeah.
you.
I just have, what I see is the assumption is that because during the interactive mapping process where people could go online and put their comments on there, they would learn how this process was working. And that's probably true of those who did that. But there's a significant part of our community that doesn't do that. And in section 2.3 of the active transportation plan, it indicates that walking and biking events were to be part of the planning process. And I believe that leaving this key process pretty much completely out weakens the plan very significantly. And we need to reconsider if we're going to push this forward with incomplete data, because we've excluded a large part of our population from participating because they didn't do it online. And so they're probably not even paying attention to what's going on, because half the delivery was done in a venue and in a format that they don't participate in. And I just think that we need to really think about this, because 15 years from now, we're still going to be living with the decisions we make today. And we want to get it right. And I don't believe we're going to get it right if we don't have a proper consultation process in place and actually do it. And as I said earlier in this process, I believe we should have stopped for a while, and my mind hasn't changed. And in this conversation this evening, it is just confirming that the process is not getting through to enough people, and the understanding isn't there.
To address Councillor Mitchell through the chair.
Sure.
We do have a deadline. So part of the grant funding is based on a March 31st deadline. So I can appreciate, I can deeply appreciate what Councillor Mitchell is saying. The intention was to have some extremely interactive sessions.
May I say that is not a deadline that we have to meet. We cannot apply for a grant. We're not required to do that.
Then
And
we
if we
would
get it wrong, but we get money to get it wrong, what's the point?
then we would pay $50,000 to McElhaney out of our own coffers if we're to delay the deadline, because the deadline is set forth by the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. It is a choice that council has, is to increase our own budget so that we can lengthen this. However, yeah, we would be giving up funding already granted to us.
If I may, we are on halfway through a presentation, and we are our time is running out. If we're having discussions here that are something we can discuss as council, I wonder if we could move forward and get the rest of the presentation from Kevin. Are we in agreement?
You bet.
Thank you.
So let's pick her up. So network, thank you very much for the comments with regards to the network itself. Those are things we can certainly address and then quickly revise as required. They won't fundamentally change the overall network and how the network is coordinated as part of the project itself. One of the big things, and probably one of the more important things actually in the overall active transportation plan, really is the informal trail network. What you can see here is the informal trail network that was provided to us by Strategic Resources and the mapping that they had done with I believe it was the biking group. The green, I know that the map isn't overly great. The green trail is the public trails. The pink trails are the informal trails on private lands at this stage. But what you can see from this is how well connected the existing trail network is to the surrounding area. And the importance of that for the future of the network for Port McNeill is huge. A lot of these informal trails, those are the trails that become formal over time, and as the region grows, provides key connections with it into and out of the community. And as such, that's one of the reasons we focused on the trail section as much as we did, providing that trail hierarchy and that trail specifications, is to help look at formalizing these over time and providing recommendations on different tools that can be used to start having conversations with those private landowners about what those formalizing those trails might look like for the town.
Question on the trails, Shelley?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm struggling a little with this piece. So how do we as a town, like on page 18, it said 1 in 4 don't know about these trails. So now we're putting this in an active transportation plan where more than 1 in 4 will start to know about the trails. So how do we promote the existing trails while considering liability issues? So for example, when I worked for Vancouver Island North Tourism, the reason that there's only a certain amount of trails on their trail app is because those are the ones that they have approval for. And liability wise, they can't let anybody know about the other ones. So how do we balance that? How do we, yeah, I just need a little bit of help on this one.
Good question.
Certainly, Mayor Wickstrom. The first thing is letting people know that these are, letting people know that these are trails on private lands. These are not public trails, and they're not specifically open to use at this time. But to also provide a framework for the town to begin formal conversations with the private landowners to allow people to utilize the trails. And there's a lot of different tools that a local government has to look at formalizing those relationships with private landowners to allow people to use trails. And I identified a couple of those tools in the active transportation plan. Some of them are licenses of occupation or memorandums of understanding, and there's different tools that can be used to deal with that. And almost every one of those agreements, Mayor Wickstrom, is in regards to liability and how that liability is addressed. Also, maintenance. One of the key elements that you'll see in a lot of the agreements is when the trails can be open and when they can't be due to fire seasons and things of that nature. And so all of those things need to be considered when those discussions occur with the private landowner. But we know that these are being used and those liabilities exist now, and identifying them and beginning formal conversations to allow, if the town wishes, for these trails to be, or at least some of the trails to be formalized as part of the transportation network for the future.
So is there also an educational piece for future trails as well? So people just don't start ripping trails all over the place, that there's a standard and a process. Should we be including that in our OCP as well? Or sorry, in our active transportation plan?
to Mayor Wexstrom, yes, certainly that is, and one of the things I did identify was education programs in general with regard to active transportation, what that means for the town, what that means to get people using the on-road active transportation network, and getting people to understand what off-road, the off-road informal trail network might mean to the community.
Thank you.
So the next slide really talks about the projects that were identified through the various consultations and the prioritization. We asked people to prioritize going through and ranking from 1 to 12 throughout the process. One thing I want to make clear is that every one of these projects are actually key projects for the active transportation network that were identified by the community. What that means is that allows council, if an opportunity arises or one of the key elements of these projects wants to be done prior to another, if council has the ability to find funding for one and not the other, that there's not an issue with that because it continues to contribute to the overall objective of implementing the active transportation plan. But based on our prioritization, the top three, as you see here, Mine Road and the pedestrian crosswalks on Campbell Way, were the prioritized projects through the survey of just over 80 people, I believe, that actually answered the survey, both hard copy and digitally. So what we did is we took those three and we provided some cost estimates based on those priority projects. So Class C cost estimates, which are typically the level of information required for going after infrastructure grants. So the Mine Road multi-use trail corridor was providing alignment for that and costed out with typical cross sections. And then of course for the two pedestrian controlled crossings on Campbell Way. What you'll find is that the pathway along Mine Road, an estimate based on typical construction methods required for, based on the specifications for the BC Active Transportation Guide, is approximately $1.6 million for that distance of trail. And then the actual pedestrian active crosswalks are approximately 30,000 a piece for the standards and the electrical work to have those constructed and installed. So when we look at the overall recommendations, there's sort of three areas of recommendation for the project. One is around sort of policy recommendations for implementation, and that's really how we integrate the active transportation plan into the official community plan, because they're concurrent processes. That's really around the healthy and active living, the actual targets we talked about, and the climate change and the environment component, those key greenhouse gas reduction targets that were a component of the active transportation plan. The other is, that we just talked about, is developing a program to formalize those trails on private lands and getting in with the people that own those lands to start having those conversations, looking at what that might look like for the town and what type of agreements can be brought into place. Program recommendations, again, is developing education programs on how to use that active transportation network and what that looks like. And then funding and implementation recommendations. I've highlighted this one funding implementation recommendation because I think it's the most effective for any community to look at before they really do anything else, is the cost-effective wins. And one of the key things that Port McNeill has done very, very well is a sidewalk improvement program. A very, very effective and proactive program, which has resulted in a great sidewalk network, existing sidewalk network within the community. To integrate a program where you were to look at painting bike lanes and even signage into a program of that nature would have a huge benefit and would be relatively low cost and very quick wins to expanding the active transportation network in a very quick fashion by integrating that into the capital budget. While that's going on, you can easily look at the other projects that are more costly and look at for various different granting opportunities to help fund those projects. Even the pedestrian lights, they're $30,000. That is expensive still. And there's granting programs that allow for those sort of smaller infrastructure projects, and then the big infrastructure project type granting programs that will help you build out the active transportation plan over time.
Question on the recommendations.
Go ahead.
So on 5.1, 5.2, it says these options should be discussed with, I think that's supposed to be existing, not exiting landowners. But I'm wondering if we should say First Nations, landowners and First Nations. And then the other one, I mean, this is council majority will have to decide on that, but 5.3.3 says seek out partnerships. I would suggest with First Nations, local groups and the regional district. That's a piece that's missing there.
Great. Kevin, I have a question regarding the $1.6 million
Mhm.
project along Mine Road.
Yep.
I looked at the different graphs, the schematics there. What are we getting for 1.6? Is that a walkway and a cycling path lit?
Mhm.
Like that's kind of the Cadillac, is that correct?
Yeah, so the standards that we used are based on the BC Active Transportation Guide for multi-use trails. So if you're going after a BC Active Transportation Granting Program, you're going to have to follow the standard, and they're very explicit about that. So this was designed based on that standard. Basically, it is a 3.5 to 4 meter wide asphalt pathway, multi-use for both bikes and cyclists. It would basically follow the general road alignment of Mine Road, but would weave in and out as permitted by the existing right-of-way. Would include pedestrian lighting, seating, benches, bollards where possible for protection if there's a fall area. Also includes retaining structures in certain areas of the road, because there is actually quite a fall off some of the areas of the road that would require retaining of the actual multi-use trail to actually keep it at the same level as the road itself in some areas, where that you don't have the ability to actually drop it down because it's privately owned properties and things of that nature. So it includes all of that. Is it the Cadillac? It is the standard as required under the BC Active Transportation Plan, and what we basically quote on.
So when I'm looking at detail A, B, C, D, et cetera, though that's
Mhm.
pertinent because the graph is the pictures are quite small. That's related to specific sections of the trail. Is that correct?
That is correct. So
Okay.
if you see here, it's really hard to see because my image is really crappy, but that actually says detail A, which relates to this detail here.
Yeah.
And this letter will be detail B, which will relate to this image here. And so you
Perfect.
can look at that and it'll relate to particular details of where those details would apply along the corridor itself.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
So quick question. So that is if we apply for an active transportation grant, we could do something different and pay for it ourselves at a lower cost and still be meeting active transportation like objectives, correct?
100%.
Okay.
That is 100% correct. You could go with a potential gravel trail on portions of it or all of it, or do portions that are that meet the standard and some portions that might not. 100%. You can mix and match like that as makes sense for the community.
This plan would be necessary to go for grant funding, though, is what I'm hearing.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Under section 4.0, the priority projects, and then you get into table 6 and the low capital, and underneath there it says that the low capital are relatively easy to plan for and included in the 10-year capital plan for the town.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have that?
Those low capital projects are the ones that this highlighted recommendation are about. These are the ones that I do recommend that are looked at as part of the regular annual budgeting process to integrate those in for implementation.
Okay. Go ahead. We have 8 minutes until our next
I was just
meeting
going to say
starts.
maybe the wording should say then that it, because I don't think we have a 10-year capital, do we? Although I think that's what we were discussing. Sorry, Kevin, it's not really you. It's just this is kind of triggering, not you, it's me. It's triggering something else because that I think is an important thing to have. If this plan is referring to a 10-year capital plan, then we should have a 10-year capital plan, right?
And to your point, Anne Marie, I think that's what we started talking about at our last budget meeting, was looking to start actually planning out further in our planning, in our capital plan. So, Kevin, we're going to run out of time here pretty soon. It's 6:53.
So perfect. I can give, I'm right at the end anyway. So next steps are, this is if council decides that they do want to continue with the grant program, that this needs to be submitted to the province next week. Next steps, I've already touched base on this, is integrating that signage and line painting components into that capital improvement programs that the community currently has. And then, of course, the developing the strategy to begin contacting the private landowners to begin having those discussions about formalizing the trails that are being used by the community at this stage. There you go. That's
it.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Hey gang, we've got 6 minutes. If there's time for one more question, otherwise we'll just break and then come back in for our regular meeting. But if there is a question, please put it forward.
Yes, I have a question. If you could just review, your plan references some figures that aren't accurate, like 3.4, it says see figure 5 and it should be figure 8 as far as I can see. And there was 3.13 refers to table 1. But to me, it sounded like it should be referring to table 3. That's just a couple housekeeping items. I'm a little, I get the big projects and I like your idea about quick wins, but I would really was kind of expecting to see a little more detail, like we need 10 cycling signs or something for our route, or this ditch would be really ideal if you filled this one in. You have an opportunity to pave this dirt shoulder here. The 2 crosswalks are, like not even really our jurisdiction. We were offered a street light at the top of the hill there, and we declined it. So I was really expecting more like quick, like you say, quick wins, small stuff we could do that maybe Public Works has an extra couple grand and can bang out a few signs. And I just wanted to make that comment. Thanks.
To your comment, then I would have this question. Are those things that need to be in the active transport plan, or is once the routes are identified, we, along with our Public Works and department, would assess those very specific details that would be necessary to follow through? That was wordy. So does it have to go in the plan, or can we just address it as we roll through it?
But typically, as soon as you've identified, you use active transportation plan to identify your networks and what your typical standards are going to be for your active transportation infrastructure. From there, you utilize that to then begin doing determining where you want to focus on first, begin working away there typically in a phased manner because of the cost of some of this infrastructure could be.
Okay, thank you. So with that, could I get just want to say thank you, Kevin, for your time this evening. And if I could get a motion to adjourn, please. Thank you. Okay. Thanks a lot, Kevin. We appreciate your time, and thank you. And I'm sure we'll follow up with further comments through Pete. Thank you.
Take care, all.